All right. So, what we're going to talk about today is why more information won't help, how too much information can lead to enchantment and can fool you into believing things that you don't want to believe or don't actually act out in the world. And all of this leads to the confusion, all because we don't understand when we don't need more information to make an action in the world. And that causes us basically choice paralysis. So I think first it's important to differentiate between knowledge and information. And so I'd like to propose the following. Knowledge is something that you create from the information you have. It's purely in your head. It's not outside of you, right? You can convey information to people and hope they get the same knowledge that you got from that information, right? But that's not as reliable as we would like, although it certainly works for a lot of things. I've talked about this before. You can see a video here about learning versus training, right? Or education rather versus training. Like how we learn is important, right? And it's not through the sort of information that is propositional. And that's why I think we're confused, because a lot of the information we have is propositional, but that's not the information that moves us the most. But let's just think for a second why this is important. When we keep getting information, our brains get overloaded, our memories are limited, especially our short-term memories. And in order for us to make, we'll say, the right connections, we need to hold this stuff in our head, at the same time. But of course, we can only do that for so long. And so people who talk very quickly, who keep going on and on about details, they are enchanting you. Now, enchantment isn't necessarily bad. It can be good, right? But you can get overwhelmed. And when you're overwhelmed, you default to certain types of decisions. Emotional valence becomes much more important, right? And that's part of how people, confuse you, right? And cause you to do things that maybe you shouldn't be doing or know better than to do. There are concepts out there like love bombing, which I had never heard of until about 5 years ago. And I was like, what is that? And I was like, oh, I see how that works, right? Somebody just throws so much love at you that you kind of forget that, maybe they've got problems. Like maybe they've never had a stable relationship. Maybe they're an alcoholic. Maybe, could be anything, right? But they give you so much attention that you're just overwhelmed and you sort of look past all their flaws. And that obviously is not particularly good for you. And that's a case of, so much information about how much attention they're putting on you just overwhelms your brain and you can't make good decisions. And that's why this is sort of important. I think a lot of people don't realize information is infinite for real. There is just so much information, so much detail about things that you could go into, right? But it doesn't make any sense to talk about the atomic construction of the plastic that makes up your plastic blinds. I mean, not in any context, but for most people, for almost everybody, that doesn't matter. But that information is available. That level of detail exists. And so it's very easy to overlook, well, how much do I need to know about my plastic blinds, right? Or how much do I need to know about the lumber used to build my house? Or how much do I need to know about the glass in my windows? And these may seem like sort of silly, banal examples, but actually you have to do that with everything. How do I know if I should do business with this person? How do I know if their honesty even matters? Because people tend to be dishonest about many things. I don't think there's any stopping that. It's because we're limited, right? We can't know everything, and so all the things we know about, if we speak about them, we can't be honest about them because we don't have the information, the knowledge, the detail, right? So if somebody tells you, hey, these two stocks are correlated, you should buy this one because the other one went up. Well, I mean, maybe, right? But also, if the stock goes down, did they lie? I mean, what they said wasn't true, right? It didn't go up. So that's not a deliberate act. It's not malicious, right? It's just a function of them believing that they see a pattern or have some knowledge that is incorrect. That's all. And everybody makes mistakes. So, but can we tell when mistakes go too far, right? And I think we can. I think that's what we're missing, right? Because we overvalue the fact of information, right? The existence of information, while undervaluing the importance of pieces of information. And that's really what I'm talking about here. More information is not better because we don't necessarily know what to do with it. And most of it is probably never going to help us ever. And that's what we need to come to terms with, because we're living in what I refer to as the age of gnosis, right? Where knowledge has been squished to propositions, right? Roughly speaking, a feature of language, of spoken and written language. And those propositions are flat. And the only way to measure them in a world of flatness is by quantity. How many are there? Right? And so we want a normative order, right? And normative is, well, what are the vast majority of the people doing? Well, I don't know. They're lemmings running off a cliff. I know that's not real, but it's also funny. And there's a great video game based on that principle. That just because everybody else is doing it doesn't mean you should do it. It doesn't mean they should do it either, by the way, which is far more important. And that's the importance, or the qualities, I should say, of the information. Right? One quality of information might be its importance. Another quality of information might be how it relates to the layer of detail that you're trying to analyze. So again, I don't need to know the chemical makeup of my plastic blinds to know how to install them. And that information is available. I just don't need it to do the installation. And we do this all the time, right? This is roughly speaking relevance realization, although I've got my qualms with that term. Also, I use it all the time, right? Like, I just think it's more of a black box and a magic thing than other people who think it's definable. This idea of too much information, the flood of information, is something we're just not accounting for. Why do we have short attention spans? Because we're seeking more information. And that's what leads to anxiety, by the way. It's not the only thing, but it's a big factor right now. Most anxiety is caused by people paying too much attention to something that will flood them with information left, right, and center, right? That's a big problem. Whether it's Facebook or X or Rumble or YouTube or Blue Sky or any of these things, right? There's just way too much information. And so it needs to be filtered. All information needs to be filtered. You can't pay attention to all the information. Your attention is limited. It's far more limited than anything else. And that's one of the problems. Right? If you have a high IQ, but a very short attention span, your high IQ is not doing you any good at all. Right? It's probably harming you, in fact, but that's a different video. If you want to see that video, comment below. And the thing is, I think there's probably different types of information, right? There's information that's sort of absolute information, right? Stuff that either, will kill you or will make you better, right? And then there's sort of relative information that affords improvement. And we don't differentiate these things, and maybe we don't need to, right? The purpose of telling you all this is not so that you have information that you can create the knowledge that you can change yourself with, because that's ridiculous. It's to show you that what you're trying to do is impossible and you need a new plan. You don't necessarily know what's relevant to you. So let's take boxes. Let's suppose you need a box to mail something to somebody. Really, the easiest, quickest, shortest form for what you need to know about that box is if it's big enough to fit the thing you're trying to ship. That's really it, right? Now, you can object, right? And I get that. Like, I understand you could always poke holes in this, but you can always poke holes in anything. So maybe that's kind of the move that a typical 3 or 4-year-old would do, because it is, right? So you can always find more detail to pay attention to. And you can say, well, look, Mark, realistically, if the box is too big, it won't work well, right? And it's possibly, it could be too big that you can't ship it via the carrier that you want, right? Because different carriers have different box size standards. And like, kind of fair enough. Like, I get that. But it will work almost certainly, right? And so it's a little weird way to think about it. And if the box is too flimsy for the thing you're shipping, it won't work. And like I said, these are sort of fair ways to think about this. But in practice, almost any box will do as long as it's not too small. So that's like really important on how to nail that down. And you can always say like, oh, we want a box that's slightly big enough, made out of tough enough material, right? Or with tough enough construction, which is actually more relevant than the actual material, right? And that's less information than the objections, right? But it's enough to do the task, right? Now, notice that the composition of the box isn't relevant. The structure of the box isn't really relevant. The amount of glue, the millimeter thickness, right? These things aren't actually relevant. Like the internal structure of the cardboard is, because there's different ways of having cardboard. These things aren't relevant, right? And you kind of know that because you don't make all these calculations when you're going to find a box to ship something. The relevant calculations are too big and too small and too flimsy. That's it. I mean, really the rest of this is nonsense, but there's a lot of information that you just don't need. Now, I don't want you to think that this is a trivial example. It's not. You'll have to think about it maybe, but it's not. And let's sort of abstract this out to people. So let's suppose you meet somebody and you find out that they're willing to lie about a subject that is, we'll say, the most important subject to you or in that moment or whatever, right? Maybe it's a coworker and he's willing to tell you that he did work that he did not do. And because he's a coworker and you rely on him to do his work, this is a really important thing to know. Now, it could be isolated that he only lies about not being lazy or something, or not being competent or something, right? And you don't know. And as long as you're not trying to fix that, not a problem, and it's not a big deal why he's lying about that thing, but it's the most important thing to you in that situation, you don't need to trust them at that point. You can say, well, if they're going to lie about the most important thing, then they're probably going to lie about everything. And that will generally be true. You can try to redeem them. I have a live stream about that. Don't do that, right? Don't do that. And say, yeah, but you know what? They take out the garbage for their parents. All right? These things aren't relevant. And you sort of see this in The Matrix, right? Where they're interrogating Mr. Anderson, right? And they're saying, in one world, right? There's listing, you take out your garbage for your landlady. You know, it's what? Right? These things aren't relevant. Now, they're relevant to the story. I get that, right? But the fact that he's, we'll say, good in one world, one of several worlds in The Matrix, by the way, does not translate to his whole life, because he's a hacker criminal, basically, right? Who's broken every cyber crime law we have on the books. what? And so having this additional information just gives you a bad image of whether or not this is a good or bad person, at least from the perspective of the agents. So that's interesting, right? Because you can see this trope of more information just covering up the important bits of information right there. Now you can argue that ultimately he's a good guy and therefore that's not this video. But still, like, that's what happened, right? One piece of information covers up the other pieces of information, right? And that's actually how a lot of these reputation online systems work, right? They flood the internet with good reviews on something so you can't see the bad reviews. That's what they do. It's not all they do. It's not the way all of them work, but it's the way most of them work. It's through flood of information. They flood good reviews. Suddenly the top things in the search are good things. This is a side effect of a decentralized system, by the way. There's no way around it. Sorry. Just one of these trade-offs you didn't know you made. And that's the thing. You can abstract all this to people. And the trick of more information is exactly that. It's getting you to change your assumption about the bad fact in favor of the good fact. And I think people misunderstand not having enough information to make a decision with needing more information before making one, because there's a gap there, right? There's a gap between not enough information to make a decision and, needing more information before you can actually make that decision, right? So you can make a decision when you have enough information. That means the important discernment is when you have enough information to make a decision. If you get caught in the trap of wanting a perfect answer, that means you need perfect information, which you will never have access to ever, in order to even make a move. And the problem is, there are several problems. The main problem is time. As time moves on, information changes, and the relationship of that information to the action changes. And so you either have to make a very quick move right at the end when you have just the, quote, perfect amount of information, if such a thing even exists, which I doubt, and that's not possible for a bunch of things because a bunch of things can't be done that quickly, right? Or you have to give up and say, I just need good enough information to take an action, right? I don't need to know someone's whole life history if they're a drug addict to know whether or not I should follow their advice. They're a drug addict. You should not follow their advice. It's not that hard, right? Oh, well, they gave good advice back before they were a drug addict. Okay, and yes, maybe when they're sober, sometimes they'll still give me good advice, but I don't have enough information about when those times are. And so I'm better off ignoring all of their advice because I have enough information to know that I can't have enough information to discern their good advice from their bad advice. So I should just not take their advice. Not listen to it. Not ask for it even, right? I mean, a lot of times I ask people for advice when I've already made up my mind and I have an answer because I want them to feel included. There's nothing wrong with that. And there's also the off chance that they'll come up with a perspective that wasn't in my head. And I will change my mind. That's always possible, right? But I don't exclude people because I've made up my mind. I also don't include people that are completely unreliable, or even more unreliable than reliable, or even will give extremely bad advice randomly for reasons I can't understand because I don't have access to what kind of drugs they're on, whether or not they took them recently, right? How much of an alcoholic are they? Are they a day drinker? Like, you don't have access to that anyway. This perfection of information thing isn't going to happen. The solution isn't more information. It's actually less information, but the right information, the quality information. And to a large extent, that's what I'm always trying to get people to look at is quality. Where should your discernment be? On quality. This is not easy because it's not scientific. It's not materialistic. It's not individualistic, right? You often can't see the quality of something by yourself. You need help, right? So don't get fooled by more information when it won't help, which is most of the time. Understand upfront how much information you need to make a decision, right? And seek it out and test that by asking other people to help you with your decision, for their advice on your decision. Because often they'll ask you questions you don't have the answers to, and that is more likely to be relevant than whatever you're pointing at. And that's good to know, because relevance realization really can only be done through distributed cognition. Now, we can make other arguments, we can make objections, because you can object to anything like any 3 or 4-year-old does. This is not hard, and I am not interested. What I am interested in is getting you to understand the importance of having other people help you, submitting to their advice, but being careful whose advice you submit to, whose signals you're following, right? People who leave their families generally tend to not be good at leading communities, for example. This shouldn't be a surprise. Not quite sure why I'd have to say this, but I think I do, actually, which is weird, right? Alcoholics are not likely to be nonviolent, right? Some are. That's the exception, not the rule. Therefore, if you want to avoid violent people, you avoid alcoholics, whether they're drinking or not, by the way, because the effects of any kind of drug, alcohol included, don't only manifest when they're under the influence of the chemical. I hate to break it to you. That can be a big problem, by the way. It could also be an advantage if you're using things medicinally, which you're not doing with illicit drugs, by the way, but glad that you may think so. But clearly shown in the research, of which we have 80 years worth, to be not true, pretty reliably. Not in 100% of cases, because nothing's 100% perfect. More information won't help, right? Once you've done studies for 80 years on the use of psychedelics, you can draw some pretty fair conclusions about them and move on with your life, rather than pursuing them as something that they've never really reliably done for anybody. That's good to know, right? So you could always do more studies, right? We could always continue to study psychedelics and look for good effects forever. That is what we seem to be doing, even though we know that they're too unstable, too unreliable, and that your interaction relies on too many external factors that we just don't know anything about, right? And probably can't know anything about, more importantly. And so in the past, every religious tradition that's lasted has basically said, don't do these things because their experience is not superior to the experience that following the religious practice will give you, and there are horrible side effects. Things can go terribly wrong. That's distributed cognition through time that tells you this is why this is bad. And so more studies aren't going to yield any different result. The studies have been done. They're finished. Yeah, we need to stop. We're not finding any new information. That's another hint for too much information. How many studies does it take, right? Salt. They studied salt for years. Salt and blood pressure. And came to the conclusion that salt caused high blood pressure. Well, it does for about 14% or 12% of the population, I forget. And for almost everybody else, it does not. And it never did. It's not like it changed from the 50s or 40s or whenever they started this until now, right? And so that more information that you got flooded with for decades about salt causing high blood pressure and being bad for your heart was always wrong, was always completely incorrect and backwards. Always, right? But we had a flood of information and it fooled us. And that's what happens. So hopefully you can see how dangerous too much information is, and hopefully you can get a sense for how to get around this problem, or at least start paying attention to it so that you're less enchanted, less prone to being fooled, more able to stand up against it and fight the temptation of going after more information, because while you're seeking information, you're not doing things in the world. And most of the best quality information comes from interacting with reality, not reading books, not going to school, not having deep conversations. I'm not saying those things are bad and you shouldn't do them, but the more of that you do, the less interaction with the outside world you will have, and therefore the less quality information you will get, and therefore the quality of your knowledge will not be as deep. And I would argue you will not be able to develop wisdom unless you have regular, strong interactions with reality. And with that, I'd like to thank you for giving me the thing that I value the most, which is your time and attention.